I think Chrono Trigger might be a perfect video game. That's not something I say lightly. I think the worst thing you can do as a reviewer is suggest that something is perfect without adequately explaining why. But I truly believe, with all my heart and soul, that Chrono Trigger might be a perfect video game. At the very least, I'd say it's a perfect JRPG. I know that all sounds like hyperbole, and I don't intend for it to, but no matter how objectively I try to view this game, I can't find a single complaint that I would consider significant enough to damn the game as an overall package. Any other game that I'd contend as a greatest of all time candidate usually comes with at least one big caveat. Sonic 3 and Knuckles is incredible if you ignore the small handful of instances where the level design gets kinda dumb, and the fact that you needed to buy 2 games to play the whole thing. Super Metroid is fantastic if you can adjust to its floaty jump physics and put up with somewhat cumbersome controls. Metal Gear Solid 3 is a masterpiece, if you're fine with sifting through a half dozen menus over and over, and again can put up with somewhat cumbersome controls. But Chrono Trigger is one of those rare instances where there isn't a single flaw. If you don't like Chrono Trigger, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say it's probably because you just don't like JRPGs in general. Chrono Trigger began as an idea from Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, who dreamt of an RPG that was all the best parts of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest combined. So while on a business trip alongside Dragon Quest creator Yuji Horii, Sakaguchi would run his pitch by the man himself. Horii showed interest in the idea, and after Square received the okay from Enix to borrow him for the project, work on the new crossover game would begin in earnest in early 1993. Horii would even bring along the talents of regular Dragon Quest collaborator Akira Toriyama, himself at the tail end of his incredibly popular Dragon Ball manga run, to design the game's characters and world. Together, the three would become known as the Dream Team. The game itself would be spawned from the same project that resulted in Secret of Mana, and at first it was planned to be a part of the Mana franchise under the working title Mario Island. But as time went on, and after being folded into the Final Fantasy VI team after the release of that game, it grew into an entirely new project, albeit one very much built from the same foundation as the Mana games. Like Secret of Mana, the player controls a party of 3 characters through a variety of large, open environments full of roaming enemies and monsters. Battles occur at fixed points, either by making contact with an enemy on the field or passing over certain trigger spots on the ground, and sometimes multiple battles will even string together in a row. In one particular dungeon, making any sort of noise in-game will also result in an ambush. Not even the save point is safe. Instead of opting for action-based combat like Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger instead uses an evolution of Final Fantasy's active time battle system, here dubbed ATB version 2. Just like the standard ATB, characters are granted turns in semi-real time, dictated by a gauge that fills based on each combatant's speed stat, and actions will occur even as the player is scrolling through the various menus. Here though, unlike other turn-based RPGs of the time, battles are not separated into their own dedicated screens. They instead play out right on the field, with enemies and party members taking preset positions across the screen depending on where the battle was triggered. The transitions in and out of battle are almost completely seamless, lacking any sort of cuts or loading screens, and according to the programmers, this was very difficult to pull off. And at any point you can move the on-screen window at the press of a button to prevent characters from getting Mike Wazowski'd by the text box. Party members can choose to attack physically or use items, as you'd expect, as well as use one of various techs, which can include character-specific special abilities, or, once you've been granted them, magic spells. Some techs will hit only singular targets, and while the range capabilities of your weapons don't matter, a character with a sword can still hit flying enemies for instance, enemy positioning does matter. Many techs can hit multiple enemies at once, operating on area of effect determined by the enemy's positions on the field. For example, Chrono's Cyclone hits enemies in a wide circle centered on a specific enemy of your choosing, while his Slash technique will hit any enemy positioned in a straight line between him and his target. Enemies will sometimes even try to trip you up, throwing your party members or other enemies around to screw with the current formation, or even attacking other monsters to trigger certain counterattacks. Each of the 7 total party members has a list of techniques that is almost entirely exclusive to them, in most cases themed around a certain element seen on their status screen, ensuring that each character will always have a specific role and advantages over others, and also that no one character will ever become too overpowered, encouraging the player to swap characters in and out of their current party depending on the situation. In addition to the standard experience points, tech points are gained at the end of battles that will grant party members more techniques in a set order as the game progresses, And in addition to single character abilities, there are also dual and triple techs, which utilize 2 or more characters at once to combine techniques for various effects, usually uber powerful attacks or spells, or even a party-wide full heal. Most dual or triple techs are learned whenever the required characters with compatible abilities are in the party together at the end of a battle, and almost all of the triple techs require Chrono to be in the party, although certain accessories gained later on grant special Chrono-less techs as well. Just like standard techs, some even have specific areas of effect, such as only hitting enemies who are in a straight horizontal line, or only affecting enemies directly in front of a certain party member. Since dual and triple techs use up each character's ATB gauge just like any other action would, they offer a cool little bit of strategy and risk-reward in that you can decide whether to pelt enemies with a handful of faster, weaker attacks, or sacrifice 2 or even 3 characters' turns all at once to fire off a more powerful attack. It's a simple but effective way of keeping each character's role in battle meaningful while giving the player a wide breadth of options at any given point. And since characters not currently in the party still gain a share of EXP, there's also never any obligation to cycle in a certain character, outside of when the story requires so, of course. As well as ditching random encounters, Chrono Trigger also rethinks the typical JRPG world map. While the individual areas and dungeons in Chrono Trigger are rather dense with things to do, the larger world map in this game is best described as abbreviated, strictly there for getting from point A to B with no battles to be fought, NPCs to interact with, or obstacles to be cleared. So you never have to worry about being ambushed on your way to an inn or whatever. The explorable areas are denoted with pop-up text on screen, and in the case of towns, buildings you can and cannot enter are always distinguishable by the color of their roofs. And seeing Chrono Trigger make all these strides to reinvent, improve, or streamline age-old RPG mechanics is interesting in hindsight because the next generation of RPGs would backpedal on a lot of these. Random battles would remain the norm, as would dedicated battle screens. But that really was done out of necessity more than anything else. The 3D generation of gaming would mostly move on to the CD-ROM format, especially RPGs, as a lot of devs were unable to resist the seemingly limitless memory space the format would provide, allowing them to make absolutely massive games. But the CD-based format meant, among other things, that load times would get noticeably longer, so seamless transitions into battle largely wouldn't be possible, nor would having battle menus pop up on the field or overworld. And thus, random battles would have to return unless the devs wanted to just make a straight-up action game. So it's interesting to see how game design doesn't always move in a straight line of progress with every new tech advancement. For all intents and purposes, Chrono Trigger's format really should have become the new standard for RPGs, but the advancements of the industry at large kept that from happening for a while yet. Chrono Trigger, that's Chrono with an H, opens in the year 1000, with its lead character Chrono, no H, attending a local fair to celebrate the turn of the millennium. And the Millennial Fair serves a few different purposes here. Most obviously, it's the backdrop that will lay host to the story's inciting incident, but it also provides a few small minigames to play around with. But those minigames also serve the purpose of preparing the player for story events they'll see later on, as well as just teaching them the basic game mechanics. While there is a building full of NPCs within the game's starting village to provide traditional tutorials to the player if they so choose, the Millennial Fair allows them to take a hands-on approach to learning things right off the bat. The drinking contest prepares the player for a similar story event with Ayla later on. The dancing stage and copycat minigame teach the player that certain buttons will sometimes serve unique active functions, as opposed to every action always being selected from a menu. This minigame with the Kilwalas teaches the player how to multitask and interact with their environment on the fly. And of course, there's Gato, the singing robot that allows you to grasp the basics of the game's combat in a low-risk environment, where game overs won't occur and the only thing you have to lose is your pride. The Millennial Fair even affects later story events in ways that the player won't be expecting on an initial playthrough. Unbeknownst to a first-time player, the game is actually judging several of your actions on the fairgrounds, and those can come back to bite you. A few hours into the game, Chrono is held on trial due to a misunderstanding, and witness testimony about your behavior at the fair can sway the jury in or out of your favor. Things like ignoring a child's plea for help finding her lost pet, or even the way you interact with the party member you meet here can affect this trial. Even just taking advantage of a quick and easy source of healing, something that would be treated as innocuous and harmless in most other RPGs, will be held against you. While the results of the trial in question will still play out mostly the same in the grand scheme of things, since the only thing a guilty verdict truly does is lock you out of a few common consumable items, It's worth noting how unique this was in 1995. Back then, games didn't have any sort of built-in morality system the way a lot of RPGs today do. The idea of a game actively judging your actions to determine the quality of your character was a novel idea at the time. And some might try to claim that this isn't a fair thing for the game to do, since it never warns you that your actions will have consequences. But that just isn't true. The game does tell you. The very first thing Chrono's mom says to him after waking him up at the beginning of the game is, "I want you to behave yourself today." Absolute genius. The whole game, in fact, is full of ingenious design like that. For one, the game makes sure you've had time to learn each of the main party members' basic techs and general abilities before bringing magic into the equation to make things a little more complex. In a story that deals with time travel, the final boss is of course a prehistoric evil that eventually causes a worldwide apocalypse, and once the player is a few chapters in, the game just flat out offers us the chance to fight the final boss before we're meant to. No strings attached, no pranks, no catch. They just say, hey, if you think you're up for it, you can finish the game right now. And obviously most players on a first run are not going to be able to beat Lavos this early without exploiting some huge secret speedrunning tricks, but the very fact they even give you the option is kind of brilliant. It serves as a genuine, tangible challenge for players who think they can pull it off, while also serving as a clear demonstration to first-time players of what they'll be up against when the time does come to beat the game. It's like how in Zelda 1 you can actually open the way to Death Mountain as soon as you buy some bombs, assuming you have the skill to get past the strong monsters wandering outside. Except in Chrono Trigger's case, the game doesn't stop you from actually going through with it just because you don't have the Triforce shards, so to speak. Just about every facet of the gameplay serves to justify or reinforce some story event, or vice versa. They go so far as to explain in lore why your party can only ever travel in threes. They have the attention to detail to make sure that enemies in prehistoric times didn't drop money, and thus much of the shopping in that time period is conducted through bartering. They made sure that the only minigame that isn't foreshadowed ahead of time at the fair, that being the race with Johnny, is completely optional and grants no truly high-value rewards. There's one dungeon in the game that can be explored hours earlier than is necessary, and so the enemies there are scaled to be reasonable for a low-level party to defeat. But the boss there still poses a threat no matter what level you are, as they gave him an attack that always reduces a character's HP to 1. Probably most memorable is the character Specchio, a master of war omnipresent throughout all of time, who first appears to grant our characters their ability to use magic. But he also serves as a recurring boss, periodically changing into more powerful forms as your characters level up, and offering new rewards for each form you manage to defeat. And at level 99, he becomes a real monster of a challenge. Part tutor, part optional super boss. I love it. Nothing in Chrono Trigger feels pointless or extraneous, and that's not something I find myself saying about RPGs very often. In fact, a lot of the time, I find it's a genre that sort of revels in its own excess. And a lot of the time, yeah, that's sort of the appeal of RPGs. For a lot of the genre's fans, the more lore, the more content, the more stuff, the better. Mechanical cohesion and smooth pacing be damned. For me, personally, while I don't necessarily dislike long games, I really appreciate an RPG that knows when to cut to the chase. I feel like audiences don't really prioritize good pacing in games as much as they do in movies or TV, but I think it's still a super important aspect of games that's far too often overlooked. Or, to put it another way, I love a game that knows not to waste my time. Hell, in Chrono Trigger, you can still control your character while NPC dialogue is on screen, so you could just walk away if you happen to trigger some dialogue by accident. And my god, if there's one thing Chrono Trigger absolutely nails, it's pacing. And it's funny that I'm saying this about a game about time travel because, much like how I called Chrono Trigger a perfect game, there's a certain film centered around time travel that is also often described as being perfect. Back to the Future. And by perfect, people don't mean to imply that the film literally has no flaws. In fact, its characters are pretty one-dimensional when viewed under any real scrutiny. No, they mean that every line of dialogue or plot point brought up in the film's first act receives a proper follow-up or payoff before the movie is over. It leaves no stone unturned. Back to the Future has been shown in film school classes as an example of how to write an airtight screenplay. And in my eyes, Chrono Trigger is the video game equivalent of Back to the Future, a project worthy of being shown to aspiring game devs as an example of a quote-unquote perfect narrative. Chrono Trigger sets up everything you need to know about its story before the confrontation with Magus, a character who, upon first playthrough, may seem like he's meant to be the big bad, as he's believed to be the source of Lavos, the ultimate otherworldly evil our heroes are attempting to vanquish. And yeah, when you zoom out, Magus's lair is presented as though it could be a final dungeon. By the time you've reached it, you've visited all the game's time periods and interacted with each party member for at least one major dungeon each. And Magus's lair itself is a complex multi-floored mansion filled with 100 monsters and occupied by a mini-boss squad. And of course, Magus comes complete with his own unique battle music. All the ingredients for a satisfying RPG conclusion. But it turns out that this is just the end of the story's first act. The story up to this point had, in actuality, only been setting up all the information so the rest of the game could provide all the payoff. After your first fight with Magus, you're sent back to prehistoric times again, where you learn the actual origin of Lavos. It's an alien life form that crash-landed on Earth, causing the cataclysm that triggered the Ice Age. In the story of Chrono Trigger, Lavos was the meteor that killed the dinosaurs. I've always really liked this revelation. Our previous trip to 65 million BC established that the ancient cave people were at war with the dinosaurs, or reptites in this case, who in this story are presented as being the intellectually superior species. But since our characters are from the future, we know the humans eventually win. But when you see the actual events play out, it becomes obvious that the humans were on the verge of extinction. They were losing the war. So there's this cruel irony in the fact that Lavos, this ancient alien that will eventually cause the end of the world, is the reason humans even survived the age of dinosaurs to begin with. Just a really clever play on our expectations, if you ask me. From here, we find ourselves in a completely new time, one we haven't seen before. Until now, the different areas we visited have all more or less corresponded to iconic real-life time periods. Medieval castles, the age of dinosaurs, or my favorite iconic real-life time period, a Terminator-style hellscape ruled by rogue robots. This new era, though, is harder to pinpoint. It's apparently the Ice Age, but just a few seconds of exploring the map will bring you to a teleporter that launches you into a world only seen in your dreams, and accompanied by an ethereal, almost hypnotizing music piece. This is easily one of the game's most memorable moments, and it's in this so-called Kingdom of Zeal that the story starts to bear the fruit of all those seeds it had been planting this whole time. And Chrono Trigger avoids the pitfalls of a lot of time travel plots by just taking a very casual approach to it. It doesn't encourage you to think about the implications of things too much. Early on, the characters accidentally trigger a grandmother paradox and have to rush to correct it before they cause a disaster, but after that point, the story never really dwells on the possible consequences of our heroes abusing time travel. And even then, it is implied that some greater power, whether it be a sort of god or the very planet itself, is preventing any truly cataclysmic time travel paradoxes from occurring. But again, just like Back to the Future, every bit of lore and dialogue in this game ties into the larger narrative in some meaningful way, no matter how small. Marl's pendant, Dreamstone, the Masamune, Magus' origins, the Three Sages, you can follow a through line from each one of these that will span across and affect pretty much every other part of the story in some way. After a few more story events play out in the Kingdom of Zeal, you're granted your time machine, this game's version of the airship. Up until now, you've really only traveled through time as the story required, but here you have basically free reign to do whatever you want, and the game wastes no time in letting you take advantage of the quirks of time travel. Probably the biggest instance of this is these sealed chests that you can only open after visiting Zeal for the first time. If you power up the chests in the past but leave them unopened, you can open them in the present to find that the items inside have changed into upgraded versions. But then you can go back to the past to open the chests a second time to get the standard items as well. A great example of a game for once letting you have your cake and eat it too. And from here, the story presents to us what again feels like the lead-in to a finale, the Ocean Palace, where the insane and power-hungry Queen Zeal is attempting to harness Lavos' power to grant herself eternal life. And of course, our heroes delve deeper into the underwater fortress to thwart her. But when they reach the Queen and Lavos, our heroes' plans immediately fall flat, as their assumed trump card ends up having no effect at all, and, even more shocking, our lead character Chrono takes a final stand against the monster and meets his end. Chrono dies, and our party grieves. And it's here the game offers the player a choice. Exploit time travel to attempt to revive Chrono, or accept this turn of events and face Lavos again. That's right, you can choose to finish the game without reviving the main character. And in fact, even the game's final dungeon, the Black Omen, is entirely optional, including the battles with Queen Zeal within. You can choose to fight Lavos through various methods regardless of Chrono being in your party or not, and which ending you get will depend on whether or not Chrono is alive and breathing when Lavos finally falls. But if you want the game's good ending, of course you should take on the quest to revive Chrono and conquer the Black Omen, but also go to the trouble of completing several side quests the game presents you at this point. Not only will doing so grant you several powerful new pieces of equipment and affect tiny aspects of the game's ending, but also adds little tidbits to the game's story, most obviously by developing and expanding on the party members, but also contributing to the lore in small, subtle ways. For example, these alien enemies in the Black Omen serve to remind us of Lavos' extraterrestrial origins. And remember how you could abuse time travel to gain multiple items from the same chest? You can do something similar with the game's final dungeon, the Black Omen. The dungeon is accessible from 3 different time periods, and you can clear the dungeon 3 times, assuming you do so moving backwards through time. And while the chests in the dungeon don't respawn or anything like that, this does allow you to fight the battles with Queen Zeal more than once, which is nice because it gives you multiple chances to steal the powerful endgame equipment she possesses. But the story and time travel shenanigans wouldn't be nearly as compelling without the game's absolutely stellar cast of characters. My god, the characters. This is one of the most likable collections of party members in any story-based RPG out there. Chrono, despite being a silent protagonist, exudes a lot of spirit and spunk, no doubt thanks to the great character design work of the late great Akira Toriyama. Marl, likewise, is a spunky tomboy who's also full of genuine sweetness and compassion. And the prehistoric cave woman Ayla is both funny and admirable in her simplistic ways. Luca is the team's resident science whiz, making her a valuable asset in this story about time travel, while also acting as a great anchor for the team as a whole. She has established history as Chrono's childhood friend, she's the one who comes up with the plan to save Marl from the time paradox, she's the one who figures out how time gates work and their relation to Lavos. Not to mention, the story's inciting incident occurs as a result of the machine she invented. She also has a very sweet relationship with Robo. She repairs him when they discover his broken remains, and her respect for machines means she always treats him as though he's a real person with tangible thoughts and feelings. And Robo is my personal favorite character. I know that the arc of literally soulless machine that learns to love and value life and nature due to the influence of the humans around him is a huge cliche in science fantasy fiction, but goddammit, I'm a sucker for it and I love it every time. That part at the end of the game where he's trying to keep a brave face for Luca's sake, but he can't help crying anyway, but because he's a robot, he cries oil instead of tears. Man, I get choked up just thinking about it. But of course, the standout party member for most is definitely the aptly named Frog. Throughout his career, Akira Toriyama had a way of turning everything he touched to gold, and Frog was just another stroke of genius from him. Given only the instruction to design a creature party member for Chrono Trigger, Toriyama decided to draw a frog person instead, and this ended up influencing the character's entire backstory, wherein he was a human warrior cursed into a frog body by Magus. Frog became easily the game's most popular character by a landslide, and it's easy to see why. His arc of growing from a bullied pacifist to a strong and noble warrior would place him as the main character in almost any other RPG. But there is one final, 7th, secret party member available too. The supposedly evil Magus can be recruited into the party, should the player decide to spare him after the fall of the Kingdom of Zeal. It turns out that Magus isn't the ultimate irredeemable evil the story presented him as at first glance. In fact, his goal is actually the same as our heroes, to defeat Lavos. It's just his methods in doing so where the character's ideals clash. And you know, I can't be sure, but this feels like a very Akira Toriyama trope. Dragon Ball has at least, 4 different instances of formerly villainous characters slowly having their outer layer of evil stripped away to reveal more sympathetic traits and motivations until they eventually just become good guys. Apparently a lot of the character concepts for Chrono Trigger came from writer Masato Kato, but Toriyama would also give his input on each one, and I'd bet my left nut that Magus' redemption was a Toriyama pitch. As a party member, Magus has access to spells from each of the game's 4 elements, although he isn't able to use any dual or triple text without equipping a certain accessory. Apparently, even after teaming up with the heroes to fight Lavos, Magus still isn't very keen to play well with others. And you know what I also love about Magus? His battle theme. For one, yeah, it is just a really good piece of music, but this part at the beginning, right here, took me a long time to realize this, but that's Shala's theme. In the story, Shala is Magus' older sister, and she serves as his actual motivation. But when we fight Magus for the first time, we wouldn't know that. We haven't even met Shala yet. Magus' true intentions aren't revealed until hours later, but the music is acting as subliminal foreshadowing. It's brilliant. And the entire soundtrack is full of leitmotifs like that. This game was composer Yasunori Mitsuda's first proper composing job. He had previously been working as a sound programmer at Square, but feeling unfulfilled and dreaming of being an actual musician, he approached Sakaguchi with an ultimatum, to either give him a composing job or else he quits. Sakaguchi would agree to hire Mitsuda as the composer for Chrono Trigger, and Mitsuda wasted no time getting straight to work, with the goal of writing music pieces that were not defined by any one single genre. Reportedly, he was so passionate about finally being able to write music for a project that he would sleep at the office in the same room as his equipment in case he found inspiration for new pieces in his sleep. And combined with the stress of a hard drive crash that resulted in several pieces needing to be rewritten, Mitsuda would contract stomach ulcers partway through development. He would take sick leave, and Nobuo Uematsu would be brought in to compose a half-dozen or so tracks to fill in for him. And Uematsu is so good at tuning into another composer's style that if you had me try to guess which tracks were his and which were Mitsuda's, I would definitely fail that test. Mitsuda has stated that in hindsight he considers his work for Chrono Trigger to be a bit rough around the edges, but personally, I love the music in this game with every fiber of my being. You can feel every bit of Mitsuda's passion and excitement in the final product. Much like with Final Fantasy VI, there's not a single track I would consider a dud. The bass line from the standard battle theme is forever ingrained into my mind. Frog's theme is so unashamedly bombastic that it's adorable. And Robo's theme, well, don't you dare say he'd ever give you up. But I personally can't allow myself to bring up this game's music without talking about the end credits theme to Faraway Times. Mitsuda has said that this piece was written in the memory of an old friend who had since passed away, and was written as a way to promise they'd one day see each other again, as well as a message to the world to pass on their own hopes and dreams to future generations. It's a beautiful piece of music that genuinely nearly brings me to tears almost every time I hear it, a sentiment that I'm apparently not alone in, as Mitsuda himself cried upon seeing the game's finished ending for the first time. Even the two tracks that were cut from the final game are all-timers. Singing Mountain is so goddamn good, and it's a travesty that it isn't in the final game. Seriously, Square, I know you had an entire area planned for that music, but it would have fit the Denadoro Mountains way better than just reusing the sewer music. Upon beating the game, and assuming you've cleared the Black Omen at least once, a new option will be added to the title screen menu, a feature called New Game Plus. This mode allows you to load up an endgame file and start the story over from the beginning, but now with all your party's endgame items, equipment, levels, and techniques carrying over. Being able to steamroll through the entire game is fun enough on its own, but the real reason to play New Game Plus is to see the game's various alternate endings. Because in addition to the 2 different endings I mentioned earlier, there are 10 bonus secret endings you can access, depending on what point in the story you challenge and defeat Lavos. Many of the additional endings are comedic in nature, like this one where Marl and Luca gossip about the game's NPCs and Chrono speaks his only 2 lines in the entire game, but a few endings do offer neat little what-ifs, such as an alternate timeline where the reptites never went extinct, or one where the story plays out again in the apocalyptic future with Robo standing in for Chrono. On New Game Plus, a new time gate will also appear at the Millennial Fair that lets you fight Lavos right at the beginning of the game. And if you manage to pull it off, you'll get an interactive ending where you can talk to the game's dev team, a few of whom will even play pranks on you, such as pretending to reset the game. I also really liked this joke. New Game Plus also provides an opportunity to make different story choices on repeat runs, such as acquiring additional sets of rare equipment, or giving yourself a second chance to recruit Magus into your party if you decided to kill him the first time. You can even just decide to mess around with different party combinations to see all the different possible dialogue for each story event. Since there are 6 or 7 party members but you can only ever travel in 3s, New Game Plus is a chance to see how each character reacts to different situations throughout the game. The idea of New Game Plus was created after beta testers for the game expressed an unusually high desire to play through the game a second time, curious to see how many different story paths or alternate scenes the game's time travel concept could result in. And while the idea of a game having a second quest wasn't unheard of at the time, after all, Metroid let you start over as a fully decked-out Samus after beating the game, Chrono Trigger was the game that set the standard for what a typical New Game Plus feature would entail. Not to mention, it literally coined the term New Game Plus, which has been carried over into the industry at large. It's honestly astonishing that New Game Plus didn't instantly become a standard in RPGs from that point on. While the feature is a lot more common in games nowadays, Chrono Trigger was one of the only notable examples of it for a pretty long time. I can understand it not being compatible with action games, but if you ask me, an RPG has no excuse for not including a New Game Plus feature. But all that aside, it's a testament to how much plain fun Chrono Trigger is that people were clamoring to play it over and over from basically day one, and I've played it literally dozens of times and haven't ever gotten sick of it. And I think the thing that makes Chrono Trigger so entertaining, so endlessly replayable, is that it's just paced so incredibly well. Every dungeon lasts exactly as long as it needs to. Not a single chapter of the story drags or overstays its welcome. This is the type of thing that's really hard to convey in a review. You really just have to experience it for yourself. Nothing in this game, not a single character interaction, plot development, nor side quest, feels extraneous or redundant. It is immaculate. And looking at the staff list, I think the secret ingredient here might be Takashi Tokida. He was a writer and co-director of this game, and probably his biggest major credit before this was head writer for Final Fantasy IV, another game I specifically praised for its brisk, snappy pacing and consistently likable cast. I'll admit this is complete speculation on my part. I obviously wasn't there when this game was made, I don't know the man, but I also can't ignore the coincidence that he was given major creative roles in 2 of the most tightly scripted RPGs I've ever played. I think the man just has a real knack for knowing exactly what a game does or does not need, and being co-director of Chrono Trigger, he would be in a high enough position to have a say in what made the game's final cut. The main story covers everything it needs to and not a single line more. Any additional lore or world building is delegated to NPCs and optional content that is completely up to the player's discretion to seek out. Not once does the game force you to sit through tertiary plot details that you yourself did not choose to engage with. I think that's why the extra content added in the DS port of Chrono Trigger always felt so tacked on to me, because what could you add to this game that would actually substantially improve it? The bonus dungeon, the extra ending, and the weird VPET Farmville thing weren't anything the game desperately needed. Obviously, you could argue graphics tweaks or minor quality of life upgrades could go some way towards improving the overall experience, but stuff like that is all secondary to the overall experience. What could you realistically change that would actually make this a better game on a base level, without risk of just turning it into a different game entirely? Chrono Trigger just nails all of the fundamentals so goddamn well. Honest to God, I can't think of a single thing in this game to actually complain about. In a genre occupied by a lot of bloat and 100-hour runtimes, Chrono Trigger is a brisk 20 to 30 hours, supplemented by an optional 5 to 10 hours of side quests at the very end. It never overstays its welcome, it knows exactly what it's doing, exactly what its story did and did not need, and it wraps it all up in a charming aesthetic package courtesy of the whimsy and playfulness of the one and only Akira Toriyama. While the game was a joint effort, Sakaguchi has said of Chrono Trigger, quote, "It was Toriyama's world. We were just playing around in it." And that he infused the game with, quote, "a humor that would be impossible to pull off in a Final Fantasy game." Reportedly, basically every facet of the game's story and characters would be run by Toriyama so he could provide his own input, which just goes to show the amount of faith Hori and Sakaguchi had in him. And the utmost respect shown for Akira Toriyama, even after all these years, is so incredibly touching. May he rest in peace. If you're familiar enough with the works of the three lead minds behind Chrono Trigger, you can really start to get a sense of which elements or ideas were likely born of which creative lead. The final threat being an ancient evil was no doubt Hori's idea, as well as the way the game makes sure each character has simple but unique roles within the player's party. The plot twist of Chrono dying and the party's quest to revive him, I'd be like to attribute to Sakaguchi. And the story's overall playful setting, where, for instance, the year 1000 AD lacks cars or electricity but somehow manages to have singing robots, strikes me as very Toriyama, as does, of course, the idea that anyone can be made good. And somehow all these ideas coalesced into a final result that doesn't feel ridiculous, bloated, or convoluted. It's incredible how much this game just works. Again, I know this sounds like bias, it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but honest to God, it really does just feel like all the stars aligned for this one. Chrono Trigger is one of those once-in-a-lifetime crossover projects where leading industry experts came together and made a stellar work without heads butting, without egos clashing, without any petty squabbles, and without any major development troubles or outside factors negatively infecting the final product. Everybody involved just seemed to be so dialed in and at the top of their game, and so willing to listen to one another and to just let everyone on the project do what they do best. Chrono Trigger works not because it's the biggest or the most. Chrono Trigger works because it is a perfectly refined and accessible representation of its genre. It cuts all the bullshit, it never gives itself a chance to drag, but also never feels hectic or overwhelming. To put it simply, it's everything that's awesome about classic JRPGs without any of the things that suck about classic JRPGs. It feels like an evolution, culmination, and celebration of RPGs all at the same time. The collective ideas and work of Hori, Sakaguchi, and Toriyama resulted in a singular game that feels like the ideal poster child for JRPGs. One that I can say, with all my heart and soul, is a perfect video game.